In a quiet village nestled between the mountains, there lived a boy named Aiko. He was known for his silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because he carried the weight of a mistake that the village would not let him forget. Years ago, he had accidentally caused a fire in the elder's barn, and though he was just a child, the shame stayed with him. Whenever he passed by others, he felt their eyes not as curious, but as reminders of what he had done. One morning, Aiko sat beneath the old cedar tree near the temple, staring at the ground. His shoulders were heavy, his breath shallow. The village monk, who often watched from afar, approached quietly and sat beside him. He didn't speak right away. He simply sat, letting the silence wrap around them. Finally, he asked, "Why do you always walk with your head low?" Aiko replied, "Because I am the boy who burned the barn." The monk nodded gently and said, "Is that all you are?" Aiko didn't answer immediately. The question echoed in his mind, louder than the silence around them. "Is that all I am?" he whispered to himself. The monk picked up a small stone and placed it in Aiko's palm. "Hold this," he said. Aiko closed his hand around the stone. "Now," the monk continued, "imagine carrying it every day, never letting it go. It's small, but over time it weighs more than you think." Aiko looked down at his clenched fist. "I made a mistake," he said, "and that mistake became me." The monk nodded slowly. "We all make mistakes, but none of us are our mistakes. They are things we've done, not who we are." Aiko's eyes stayed on the stone. "Then why can't I forget?" The monk smiled gently. "Forgetting is not the goal. Understanding is. You don't need to forget what happened. You need to stop letting it define you." Aiko blinked as if a window inside him had just opened for the first time. The monk stood up and motioned for Aiko to follow. They walked slowly through the village path where familiar faces glanced at them. Aiko lowered his gaze as usual, but the monk kept his eyes forward. "Let me tell you a story," he said. "There was once a painter who ruined his first masterpiece with one careless stroke. He hung the ruined painting on his wall and stared at it every day. Years passed. People forgot the mistake, but he never did. He stopped painting altogether." Aiko frowned. "That sounds like me." The monk continued. "One day, a child came to his home and saw the painting. She said, 'It's beautiful. I wish I could paint like that.' The painter realized he had been punishing himself for years, while others saw beauty in what he called failure." Aiko walked in silence, the story soaking in. "Maybe I've been holding on to shame that others let go of long ago," he said quietly. The monk only smiled. "If this story speaks to you, subscribe now and tap the bell. Your next moment of clarity could be one video away." They reached a small bridge over a quiet stream. The monk stopped and leaned on the railing, watching the water flow beneath. "This stream," he said, "does not hold on to the leaves that fall into it. It carries them, lets them go. That's how it stays clear." Aiko stared at the current. "But I feel like the leaf," he said, "lost, drifting, not in control. The monk looked at him. Then be the stream. Aiko turned, puzzled. The stream? The monk nodded. You are not the leaf. You are not the mistake. You are the one who carries it. You can choose when to release it. The wind picked up gently, brushing through the trees. Aiko closed his eyes. For a brief moment he imagined the fire not as a brand on his name, but as something that had happened and passed. He opened his hand and let the stone fall into the water below. The ripples widened, then vanished. It's time, the monk said, to stop living in a moment that's already over. Aiko sat on the edge of the bridge, his legs dangling above the water. What if I make another mistake? He asked, his voice barely louder than the stream. The monk sat beside him. Then you learn again, he said calmly. The goal is not to live perfectly, but to live awake. Aiko looked at his reflection in the water. It trembled with each ripple. I keep trying to go back and undo it, he admitted. The monk shook his head gently. You can't unburn the barn, but you can rebuild it, stronger, wiser. The words sank deep. Aiko had spent so long reliving the past, he had forgotten he could shape the future. The monk pointed to the horizon where the sun began to dip behind the hills. Every day ends, Aiko. That is the way of all things. But endings are not punishments. They're invitations to begin again. Aiko exhaled slowly, not with pain, but release. For the first time in years, he no longer felt like the same boy. The next morning, the village was quiet as usual, but something inside Aiko was different. He walked through the same paths, past the same faces, yet felt lighter. A few villagers nodded at him. He nodded back, not with fear, with presence. He found himself back near the old barn, now long rebuilt. He hadn't stood this close in years. He ran his hand over the wood, rough but strong. A child playing nearby pointed and said, "Is that the barn from the fire?" Aiko turned, smiled softly, and replied, "Yes, and it still stands." The child looked impressed, then ran off. Aiko didn't shrink from the moment. He stayed, grounded. Behind him the monk's voice called out, "You see? It's not the fire that defines you. It's the choice to rise after it." Aiko nodded slowly. He finally understood the story wasn't about the mistake. It was about what he chose to become after it. And now that story was his to write. Later that day, Aiko returned to the temple where the monk was sweeping fallen leaves. He waited silently until the monk looked up. "You walked tall today," the monk said. Aiko nodded. "I didn't hide from the past. I stood beside it." The monk leaned on his broom and smiled. "Good, because it was never meant to cage you, only to teach you." They sat on the temple steps as the sun painted gold across the sky. Aiko asked, "What if I forget this feeling?" The monk reached into his sleeve and handed him a small scroll. Open it only when you start believing you are your past again. Aiko tucked it into his robe without peeking. He didn't need it. Not now. He looked out across the village, not with regret, but with quiet hope. The kind that doesn't shout, but stays. The boy who burned the barn, he said to himself, is gone. But the one who learned to rebuild, he remains. The monk said nothing. He didn't need to. Weeks passed, and Aiko continued to grow, not in height, but in stillness. He helped others, listened more than he spoke, and slowly became someone the village came to for quiet wisdom. No one mentioned the fire anymore, not because they forgot, but because it no longer mattered. It was no longer who he was. One evening, a traveler stopped at the village and asked the monk, "Is there a wise man here I can speak with?" The monk pointed toward the river, where Aiko was skipping stones with a child. "There," he said, "the one who once believed he was broken." The traveler watched and smiled. In that moment, Aiko laughed, free, unburdened. His story wasn't one of perfection, but of transformation. And somewhere in that, true worth had taken root. The wind whispered through the trees, and a final thought hung in the air like a question the soul couldn't ignore. What if the worst thing you've done isn't the end of your story, but the start of who you're meant to become?